All right. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening, depending upon where you are. This is Dr. Patrick Lockwood coming back to you live to discuss another wellness topic. Today, we're going to talk about the science of meditation because it's something that is becoming increasingly popular, as well as something that's been discussed in my community, in the treatment community, for a long time. And I think there are a lot of benefits, and there are also some misconceptions about what the research says, so I want to go over that. But first, just some housekeeping stuff. The gist of the book updates is The Fear Problem is still on the way out. The publishing company I'm working with is doing some good work on making it look kind of fancy and dealing with things like cover art and whatnot. So that's going as well as it can go, and I will let you know ASAP as soon as anything comes out about that. So on to today's talk. It's kind of an interesting topic because a lot of people talk about it. You know, you've got people like Deepak Chopra out there in the world recommending meditation and, you know, kind of the usefulness of meditation. You've got a lot of different, notable personalities across a variety of disciplines discussing it. And I think although these people are doing a great job of helping people try something new to get focused and manage their emotions better, it's kind of being misconstrued in some ways, especially in terms of the research. So I really want to clear that up with you today. And this is important to me because where I work at PCI Westlake Centers, there's a lot of integration of these mindfulness-based practices to help our clients manage their affective states better. And it's very important, but it's also extremely difficult. And I'll talk about maybe why that's more difficult when I talk about the brain and meditation and what it's supposed to do. So I know I did a talk back in April, one of my first talks on here, a little bit about the benefits of meditation, and I didn't feel like that was adequate enough. So I want to do a more thorough discussion today, hopefully around 30 minutes, really talking about the benefits of things like mindfulness and walking meditation and things like that. So it's important we get our terminology correct when we're talking about meditation, especially when it comes to the research, because basically every kind of meditation has been studied. And there are different amounts of research on different types of meditation, and some is theoretically more useful than others, depending upon who you read and what authors you read and all sorts of good stuff. And at the end of this, I'll mention a couple of book references that I think will be useful for a lot of people. Books that I've read that I appreciate, things like that, that I think explain meditation and the utility of meditation rather straightforwardly. But for today's talk, I generally have gone through about 60 or 70 different references to try and figure out what the gist of the research really says in the last 30 or so years. So first, the vocabulary. So there are basically two categories of meditation, and you've probably practiced both or tried both or heard about one or the other. So the first category is what we call a focused meditation. These are things like transcendental meditation, loving kindness meditations, zazen or Zen meditations, sound meditations, Kundalini yoga, pranayama meditations, Qigong kind of meditation practices, spiritual practices. Those are your focused meditations. And then there are more open, theoretically speaking, meditations or mindfulness practices. And the predominant type of meditation that we consider open, academically speaking, is what we call vipassana meditation or mindfulness meditation. And the research is, again, all over the place. And it's still new, comparatively speaking, about this particular topic, this particular skill or tool, if you want to call it that. So I just want to put that out there, that caveat out there, that although it is wonderful and I use it twice a day because it keeps me sane in some ways, I think it's something that we should look at with a skeptical eye, just so that we're not kind of putting all our eggs in one basket to feel better or achieve enlightenment or something like that. So I want to talk about 3 segments of the research on meditation. And I'm not a physician, so I'm going to say that every time something medical comes up, but I just want to talk about what the research generally states. And I've, kind of searched through a lot of research to come up with these basic points. So the research on the body and the research on the brain and the research on how our emotional states are affected by meditation is somewhat definitive. However, with regard to those 3 categories, because a lot of the research is small in the sense of the sample size is very small, or the follow-up studies and things like that are not very intensive, or maybe they don't use the most stringent statistical methods to assess outcomes. A lot of academics and even physicians are more wary of the kind of generalizing process from the research. So I want to make that caveat right now, so it doesn't seem like I'm saying it's the best. I don't want to be Deepak Chopra and just say that it's the best thing in the world, because that's ridiculous. Nothing is the best thing in the world. We have to have a completely well-rounded lifestyle, a lifestyle of wellness, as Dan Siegel would say, in order to have a healthy, optimal functioning of both our mind and our body. So let's talk about first specifically what the research says that meditation can do for our body, our health. So the research is kind of more straightforward in this department, because most research is kind of slow and breathing and kind of calming. It's not too surprising to show that the research on meditation shows that regardless of what kind of meditation, it typically slows our heart rate and our blood pressure when we're doing meditation, and for short periods of time thereafter. That kind of intuitively makes sense. There is some research, I found about 5 or 6 studies that definitively state that meditation, especially mindfulness, can help with chronic pain. There's also a wide variety of studies of different sizes and intensities and lengths that show the general practice of meditation, whether it's MBSR or other kind of structured meditations once a week or multiple times a week, can actually decrease the severity of our acute disease symptoms. So, when someone has something like a stomach ache or whatever, if we were mindfully breathing, it might tone down the intensity of the pain, so to speak. Or when someone has cancer, there's actually a fair amount of research on mindfulness and cancer that shows that people with kind of secondary and tertiary symptoms from either cancer or their treatment, they can actually diminish the intensity of those symptoms by mindfully breathing or engaging in MBSR and other types of structured meditation practices. And finally, the last general point from the research on meditation and our physical health and our body is that there's a fair amount of research that shows an increased immune response for people who consistently and regularly meditate. And the mechanisms for a lot of these different health effects are something that I think I can explain a little better when we get to the brain aspect next. But generally speaking, there's no perfect pathway between meditating and having better physical health, so to speak. It's not like a general thing. For instance, there's some research that shows that people have tried to use mindfulness meditation to help people quit smoking, and sadly the research pans out to where it's not particularly helpful. There are many more effective ways to help people with that particular health problem. So it's not a big all-encompassing thing with our health, but it can provide some benefits, especially in the short term, in the first couple of months when you do it. There aren't a lot of studies that show, people who've been meditating for a year have significantly lower heart rate for, 5 years. We don't have that kind of research right now. So they're working on it. They're actively studying it at places like Johns Hopkins and Harvard, and a lot of places on the East Coast and some on the West Coast too. But we don't have any kind of real significant long-term follow-up studies. So that's the research on the body. Generally helpful, but not necessarily a perfect catch-all treatment. So now let's talk about the brain, because I think this is important for all of us. Again, I want to try and give everyone just real basic neuroscience, neuroanatomy language so that we can have a better sense of agency, a sense of control over what we do, how we feel, how we function. And I think if I explain some of the basic brain areas affected by meditation, we can actually kind of understand why some of those health benefits I mentioned earlier make sense. So I want to talk about two different kind of categories of ideas with regard to meditation in the brain. So I want to talk about structure, like where in the brain, and then I want to talk about chemicals / activity, right? So I want to talk about where in the brain things are activated or deactivated, and I want to talk about what kind of chemical process is going on. So broadly speaking, we have a nervous system that is both kind of within our subjective control and automatic, our autonomic nervous system, which controls our heart rate, our breathing, things like that. The general kind of research on the brain and meditation shows that practitioners of a variety of types of meditation have generally better control over what we call our autonomic nervous system, which is our kind of ability to monitor our breathing, heart rate, and some of our basic immune function. And the reason we think this is true is because the self-regulatory parts of the brain, these are things like our left anterior cingulate, our right anterior insula, some of our parts of our prefrontal cortex, and our temporal parietal junction, so over here where we're talking about how our body perception and our memory and our monitoring process work together, are more activated, essentially. So what we find is these self-regulatory parts of the brain, the parts of the brain that monitor how we're doing and what's going on with us, are more focused and tuned into what's going on when we're meditating, when we're mindfully breathing. And the general kind of segment of the research here shows that consistent mindfulness meditators show a disconnection between our things like our medial prefrontal cortex for affect regulation and our right insular cortex, which is the part of our brain that gets hijacked when we don't feel safe, when we're having anxiety, and all sorts of good stuff. So basically what it shows is our medial prefrontal cortex, our self-regulatory, self-reflective process can actually shut down our hijacking parts of the brain, the parts of the brain that get overwhelmed and make us anxious and lose it and not function appropriately, so to speak. Make impulsive decisions, things like that. So those are general, basic neuroanatomy kind of outlines for mindfulness in the brain. We also show that, or I guess the research shows that in terms of chemicals, whenever someone is meditating, there are different kind of brain wave activity states you can measure with an EEG. And we show better theta states, more active, more responsive theta states in the brain when we're meditating. We can go from being in an alpha or beta state to a theta state, which will help us focus, be aware, be non-judgmental, so to speak. And one of the chemical mechanisms that research has shown is there's actually, during that theta state where we're focused and aware, there's an increase in dopamine released in parts of the midbrain responsible for motivation, attention, and processing. And this dopamine release is theoretically going to signal the upper parts of our brain and our cortex and things of that nature to focus. It's going to kind of, again, I've talked about the dopamine system from the perspective of Panksepp, and that's kind of the seeking system, the go out and do it system. So if there's increased dopamine release, it stands to reason that we're going to seek out, we're going to be more actively engaged in the sense of understanding, focus, and attention, but in a way that's not totally emotionally hijacked when we're in a panic state, where we're hyper-focused on the thing that scares us. Because again, the right insula is shut down, so to speak. So that's the basic neuroscience. I don't want to go further into it because It's so busy. There's so much terminology. There's so many brain areas. If you think about it just logically, pretty much all areas of the brain are activated during meditation, either activated or deactivated, depending upon what you're shooting for and what kind of meditation you're doing. So because there are so many different types of meditations, they're going to affect the brain slightly differently, but generally all facets of the brain are in play, with the exception of probably your motor area. But even that is kind of active. So that's the basic kind of neuroscience of meditation. Our self-reflective, self-awareness, attention areas are activated, but not in a hijacked way like when we're panicked or freaking out. Kind of in a balanced way, if that makes sense. And the nice thing is that people who meditate, according to the neuroscience research, is that generally speaking, people who engage in things like Zen meditation or more mindful meditations can actually have healthier looking brains, in the sense that they have more dense gray matter and even some more dense white matter, so that parts of the brain from our frontal cortex to our emotional midbrain can communicate better. And there are some longitudinal studies on that with like advanced meditators. But it's very, very new research. None of this is since, before 1980 or so. So this is, again, very new. There's so much more coming out. There will be a lot more coming out. I guarantee that. But generally speaking, meditation helps a lot with attention, self-reflection, self-awareness, and being able to have more seeming control over our parts of the brain that get hijacked emotionally speaking. So that's the second facet of the research. And then the third facet of the research is particularly important for what I do as a clinician and as a coach and as a business consultant, because I help a lot of people manage their feelings more adaptively so that we can, make better decisions, whether it's for our friends or family, ourselves, or our businesses. So being mindful and being grounded is a very important thing. So it's important to talk about the research on what mindfulness meditation and other meditations can actually do for our emotions. So for instance, there are a lot of studies out that talk about emotions because it's become a popular psychology thing. Mindfulness has and meditation has. Everyone mentions it like, going for a run is like the best thing in the world or something like that. But even that is not that simple. So for instance, there are a couple of what we call meta-analyses, which I've mentioned before. And meta-analyses take a look at a variety of studies and look for an overall effect size from all those different studies. And two meta-analyses show that it's actually not particularly effective in managing anxiety or anger or sadness, comparatively speaking. One from the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is a reputable journal. However, despite those two meta-analyses, there are actually many more individual studies and a few meta-analyses that disagree with those that are recent. And they show, generally speaking, a broad ability for people who engage in things like loving kindness meditations to have a more positive outlook and have a general sense of gratitude compared to people who are not doing so. Just makes sense, right? That's what a loving kindness meditation is designed for. And another thing that's generally agreed upon in the research nowadays is that mindfulness meditations, kind of vipassana meditations, will generally decrease our overall emotional reactivity and will allow us to have better attention and concentration in the short term, at least. We don't have a whole lot of, 5 years down the road kind of studies, like I said, but in the short term, it can actually be helpful. Another result that's in the research is that people engaging in things like mindfulness meditations will have reduced kind of subjective distress during times of crisis or other circumstances like that. There's this interesting correlation in the research that a few studies I found talk about. One of them that's, I think, particularly important for what all of us can think about in our lives is our ability to pay attention to what's important, right? Because we're all very busy. We all have lots going on in our lives, and it's sometimes hard for us to buckle down whenever we're anxious or angry or confused or overworked. So what they find in the research is to to that point is that the length of time that we practice can help us with developing attentional focus, our ability to pay attention, by allowing our brain to be, our attentional areas that I talked about a few minutes ago, to be more active. And then what happens is the longer you practice, everything starts to slow down. So we actually can slow down the attention circuits and actually cut out a lot of the distracting, senses, kind of our some of our visual circuits and our auditory circuits, our hearing circuits. If we're long-term meditators, those actually slow down more, which means they interfere our thinking process less, which is great. Because again, the whole point is to focus. When you do something like a focused meditation or a loving kindness meditation, and even with a mindfulness meditation where you're just following your breath, for instance, like I do, you have less interference from the outside world, from your other senses, once you get into that long-term practice. So that's the general research on that. So with regard to specific topics like anxiety and depression and ADHD and addiction, these are kind of the things that have been studied the most in the literature, in the science of psychology at least. There is a fair amount of research that generally shows that mindfulness meditation is good for managing anxiety and depression. And so goes it with other things like TM and other kinds of focused meditations and Zen meditation. However, there's actually a lot of research that's looked at ADHD, and there's more coming out too, because a lot of kids with ADHD are all over the place, and adults as well. So the general idea is, of course, mindfulness would be good for them. However, there's actually minimal support that mindfulness and other meditations can work effectively compared to other ideas like meditation and behavioral therapy to help with ADHD. So it's not as good for ADHD. And finally, something that's particularly important for the work that I do, there is research that shows that meditation can be a decent adjunctive treatment, a secondary treatment, kind of helping with addiction. So because addiction is a complex brain disease, we need something that kind of hits all the different parts of the brain. And the nice thing about meditation is it does. Because addiction is a brain disease of affect regulation, our inability to manage feelings and urges and processes. If we engage in meditation, especially mindfulness in addiction rehabs, we're more likely to get a positive outlook with maintaining sobriety and helping people stay focused and get back to work and get through treatment without losing it and all sorts of good stuff. So that's the general research on emotions and mindfulness and meditation. So I hope all that makes sense. I went through all this relatively quickly, not necessarily super intensive, because again, of the 70 studies that I have, it would be kind of mind-numbing for us to go through all of them one by one and talk about the implications of each of them. But giving a general overview and having some good caveats about, it could be, it could not be, and how much we actually know is important here, because it does generally help. Mindfulness meditation in particular is generally helpful in managing feelings and helping the brain heal and helping the brain focus better and work more effectively. This is why people like, Dan Siegel have written books like The Mindful Therapist and The Mindful Brain. Two great books I highly, highly recommend you reading. Same thing with Robert Wright's book on why meditation is true. I heard about it on Sam Harris' podcast, and I've got it now, and it's a great book. And I think if you ever need any more convincing other than what I've told you here, or other than talking to people like Andrew Holt, who I really appreciate, and Bryn Murphy, who I also very much appreciate in Australia, that's a great book for it. Robert Wright's book is absolutely fantastic. And I think, because it's a generally useful skill, and it can work for so many different facets of our life, our health, our mental well-being, and our brain functioning, we need to, give it a shot, at least, and see if it works for us. Now, it's not to say that it's a cure-all. This is something like, people like Deepak Chopra do. And no offense to the man, because he is a physician and a neuroendocrinologist and all that good stuff, but it's overplayed by a lot of yogis and spiritual coaches and all sorts of good stuff. And I would never want to sit here and be like them and just talk about how good it is and not talk about how it's not effective in certain ways. And the science on it is generally pointing in the positive direction. However, we don't have a lot of long-term follow-up studies. So to say things more definitively would not be intellectually honest. And as you know, that's my thing, is I want to kind of give everything the most intellectually honest spin. So I hope all this makes sense. I know I haven't been able to get to any comments or anything like that, so let me take a second here and see if anyone has anything. Leah Markham says hello. Hello, Leah. I hope this has been useful for you. I appreciate all of you that joined and have been here for this. I think this is kind of an important topic, and I know that it might seem hard in your current schedules and your daily life to find some time to fit in some meditation, but again, 5 minutes here, 5 minutes there, I think we all can spare 5 minutes, especially if you have an obsession with a smartphone like most people do nowadays. I really suggest that maybe you cut 5 minutes off of that smartphone usage and devote 5 minutes or so to just mindfully breathing. If you need advice on how to deal with meditation or where to start and where to find out, I'll post some resources for you guys, and there'll be some resources on the Patreon as well. But again, people like Dan Siegel have written great books about mindfulness meditation. People like my friend Andrew Holt has a great mindfulness workbook for kids. Let me see if I can find that here. Yeah, this is it. Andrew Holt. This is a great, great workbook. I hope if you have a chance to bug him on Facebook and find his book, if you've got kids or you work with kids, if you need something to help people with managing their kids, raising their kids, or if you have kids yourself and you want them to be more mindful and have a better understanding of who they are, and more self-compassion and more affect regulatory capacity, Andrew's book is fantastic. I read it. I've given the man feedback on it. It's a wonderful book. I love everything about it. Thich Nhat Hanh has all sorts of great books on mindfulness, being one of the great speakers on mindfulness. And Robert Wright's book is absolutely fantastic. So I'll post all these things in the Patreon. And as always, I appreciate you coming out. I hope this has been useful. I'm grateful for all you who support me and comment and participate, and please feel free to visit the Patreon and support me financially if you can, because again, this publishing stuff is not cheap, and I'd like to be able to purchase more research and give you guys the best science and the best scientific understanding of what's going on with wellness and how we function. And that is also an expensive endeavor. So I hope you have a good day. It's been good talking with you, and I look forward to more comments and more feedback in the future. See you in 2 weeks. Bye.